Hello everyone, my name is Byung Kim and I am the chairman of the new Consilience group NCG. Today we will address the issue of tithing, which has long been emphasized in churches. Is tithing truly a commandment from God that clergy can compel believers to follow? Or is it a device designed by the institution to maintain power and secure finances? Rather than relying on tradition, let us open the Bible itself and examine both history and today's reality. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one or and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Matthew 6:24. The tithe was an ancient Israelite taxation system. The rate was 10%, hence the term tithe, but the number itself was not the essence. Levites collected it under the supervision of the priests, and only a tenth of the tithe, was allocated to temple expenses and the priest's share. Numbers 18 and Nehemiah 10. In other words, only 1% of total income actually went to the temple. Furthermore, Deuteronomy 14 shows that the annual tithe funded participation in festivals, while the tithe every third year served as welfare for Levites, orphans, widows, and foreigners. The tithe was not the church treasury, but national finance for the community. Originally, the tithe was a festival of sharing together, but over time it degenerated into means of hoarding wealth monopolized by a select few. The term tithe simply referred to a type of tax, not a fixed rate, just as today's value-added tax is called VAT, whether it is 10% or 7%. The term tithe referred to a levy of 10% at the time, not an eternal divine law. It originated in Genesis 14:20 when Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of his income. This act was akin to paying a tax to secure residency rights in Canaan. Therefore, to view the tithe as an eternal divine law is a misconception. The modern church's interpretation merely distorts the Old Testament system. Yet the church has rigidly established this as a literal law. This is the prevalent misunderstanding of the tithe today. Today, the Catholic Church operates a system of church contributions instead of tithing. The principle is to give 1/30 of one's income, though it can be adjusted according to one's circumstances. Contributions are voluntary, not compulsory. Paradoxically, the Catholic Church's current practice aligns more closely with the New Testament principle of voluntary giving than that of some Protestant denominations who insist on taking the Bible literally. I believe the Catholic contribution system is more than just administrative. It represents a theological reflection adapted to the changing times. The modern states already collect 30 to 35% of income through taxation to fund welfare, education, and healthcare. We have entered an era in which religion can no longer be the primary provider of social welfare. Thus, setting contributions at around 10% of taxes could be seen as recognizing the state's welfare function while realistically reducing the burden on believers. At the same time, it echoes the spirit of the Old Testament. The problem is that some denominations still distort the biblical text on tithing in order to exploit large sums. Many churches today demand 10% of believers' personal income as a mandatory tithe. However, Numbers 18 clarifies the structure. First, the entire tithe was allocated to the tithe of Levi. Second, Only 10% of that was assigned to the priests for their share and temple expenses. Therefore, biblically, only 1% of the total income went to the priests. Nevertheless, today's churches ignore this structure and demand the full 10% of personal income as God's portion. This is a distortion, an interpretation completely opposite to Scripture. Deuteronomy 14:28-29 instructs, at the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the aliens, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns, may come and eat and be satisfied. This was known as the tithe for the poor. It was a welfare system within the national distribution framework for the poor, orphans, widows, and foreigners. Before states established modern welfare systems, religious institutions often played this role. In the Middle Ages, monasteries cared for the sick, educated the young, and helped the poor. Today, however, the modern states provide welfare, healthcare, and education through taxation. The era when religion was central to social welfare is over. Religion should now focus on conscience, the common good, and the practice of love. Therefore, church finances should be judged by internal consumption, but by outward sharing and public transparency. The fact that the proportion of social service expenditures in the average Korean Protestant church remains in single digits highlights a structural problem. Tithes fail to flow into love in practice. The New Testament does not command the payment of the tithes. Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for their formalistic approach in tithing. Matthew 23. And Paul wrote, each man should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion. 2 Corinthians 9. And the story of the widow's 2 copper coins shows that the value of an offering lies not in the amount of proportion, but in the heart. The principle of the New Testament is not compulsion, but voluntary giving and love. Many churches today compare various offerings, such as tithes or special donations, to an extensive degree. These funds are often used to construct lavish buildings, support the luxurious lifestyles of clergy and their associates, and even use political involvement as a pretext to intervene deeply in state affairs. The collusion between clergy and power persisted in ancient Israel, in the medieval papacy, and continues in the church today. Consequently, tithing has degenerated from a communal celebration into an accumulation of wealth by a few, becoming an exploitative tool for the privileged. The more, some churches equate tithing with 10% of a believer's income, imposing it as if it were a measure of faith. What churches must recover today is not coercion, but their original role as communities. They must respect believers' spiritual needs and communal desires, opening the way for voluntary service. Today, we have confirmed. First, the tithe was an ancient Israelite state tax with only 1% going to priests. Second, the church later turned this into compulsion, using it as a tool to maintain privilege. Third, Jesus and Paul emphasized voluntary love, not legalistic coercion. Now we must ask, where do your church's finances go? Is that money building a community of love and truth? Not in the bondage of tithing, but in the freedom of love, the kingdom of heaven is realized here and now among us. The religious revolution of the new Consilience group begins with awakening to these truths and finding the right path. Thank you for listening.